I was heading up to a remote cabin I had rented for the weekend. It was deep in the woods, miles from any sign of civilization. The idea was to get away from it all. No cell service, no work emails, just me and the quiet of the forest. The drive itself was already an ordeal. The rain had started early that morning and hadn't let up since. Sheets of water poured down, turning the narrow dirt road into a muddy mess. My windshield wipers could barely keep up, and the dense canopy above made it even darker than it should have been for late afternoon. I finally pulled up to the cabin just as dusk was creeping in. It was smaller than it had looked in the photos, more of a shack really, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get inside, dry off, and settle in. The rain hadn't stopped, and the air felt heavy and cold as I grabbed my bag from the car and hurried to the door. The cabin was simple. A small living room with a wood stove, a kitchen tucked into one corner, and a tiny bedroom in the back. It smelled of damp wood and old smoke, but it was dry and quiet, and that was all I needed. I lit the wood stove, unpacked my things, and tried to relax. By the time I finished eating a simple dinner, it was fully dark outside. The rain continued to hammer against the roof and windows, drowning out any other sound. I couldn't even hear the wind, just the constant drumming of water. It was around 9 p.m. when I noticed something odd. Through the rain-streaked window, I thought I saw movement. At first, I dismissed it as the trees swaying in the storm, but the shape was too solid, too deliberate. I stared out into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but my stomach tightened. I could barely make out the outline of a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. My first thought was that it must be a hunter or hiker who'd gotten caught in the storm, but the longer I watched, the more uneasy I felt. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, barely visible through the rain. I turned off the single lamp in the cabin, hoping to get a better look without the glare on the glass. I pressed my face to the cold window, squinting into the dark. The figure was still there, unmoving. It was hard to tell, but it looked like a man, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of his body, standing motionless in the pouring rain. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he didn't even know I was here. Maybe he was lost and didn't want to approach the cabin uninvited. But why just stand there in the rain? Why not call out or wave? I locked the door, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do. The cabin was old, and the door didn't seem particularly sturdy. I grabbed a flashlight and considered stepping out to see if he needed help, but something about the way he just stood there froze me in place. For the next hour, I sat in the dark, listening to the rain and occasionally peeking out the window. He didn't move. He didn't come closer. He just stayed there, a shadowy silhouette at the edge of the trees. Around midnight, I finally convinced myself to go to bed. Maybe he was just passing through, and by morning he'd be gone. I locked the bedroom door, though I wasn't sure why. It felt like a pointless gesture, but it gave me some small sense of control. I didn't sleep well. Every little creak of the cabin made me jump, and the rain pounding on the roof seemed to grow louder as the night went on. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up suddenly to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. There it was again, a soft, scraping sound, like someone dragging something along the wooden walls. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and crept to the window. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the noise continued. It moved slowly, circling the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and my pocket knife from my bag. I didn't dare go outside, but I felt better having something in my hand. The sound stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rain. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't at the front door, but at the side of the cabin, near the kitchen. Another knock followed, louder this time. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't want to respond. Whoever it was hadn't called out or made their presence known in any normal way. This wasn't someone looking for help. The knocking moved, now coming from the front door. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they weren't in a hurry. I backed away, retreating to the bedroom and locking the door behind me. I sat on the bed, gripping the flashlight and knife, trying to stay quiet. The knocking continued, moving around the cabin, tapping on the walls and windows. It went on for what felt like hours. I didn't dare make a sound, barely even breathing as I sat there in the dark. Eventually, the noise stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the rain, but the silence stretched on. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the rain had stopped, and pale light was streaming through the window. I cautiously crept out of the bedroom, half expecting to find the door wide open or some sign of forced entry. But everything looked the same as it had the night before. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I saw them. Footprints in the mud, circling the cabin. They were deep, the kind made by heavy boots, and they didn't lead away from the cabin. They just circled around and around. I didn't wait to see if whoever it was would come back. I threw my things in the car and got out of there as fast as I could. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, or maybe he had something worse in mind. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before, and I hope I never do again. The cabin rental company called a few days later to ask why I'd left early. I didn't give them the full story. I just said I'd changed my mind. But late at night, I still think about him standing there in the rain, watching me from the trees. I'll never know how long he had been out there before I noticed. I don't know what possessed me to keep going that night. I was on a solo hiking trip in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, trying to clear my head after a rough breakup. It was early March 2017, and the weather had been unpredictable all week. I didn't think much of it when the sky turned gray in the late afternoon, assuming it would pass like the other storms had. But as the hours dragged on, the drizzle turned into a steady downpour, and soon after that, it felt like the heavens had opened up. By the time I realized I needed to find shelter, it was too late to turn back. I was about 10 miles from my car, deep in a forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The trail I'd been following had all but vanished in the mud, and my phone's GPS had stopped working after the rain soaked through my jacket pocket. I was completely lost, cold, and soaked to the bone. I knew I couldn't spend the night out in the open. Hypothermia was a real risk. My eyes scanned the woods, looking for anything. A cave, an overhang, something. That's when I saw it. A dark shape in the distance, just barely visible through the sheets of rain. It looked like a building. Couldn't believe my luck. As I got closer, the structure came into view. It was an old cabin, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen human life in decades. The wood was warped and cracked, and the roof sagged in a way that suggested it wouldn't hold up much longer. One of the windows was shattered, and the front door hung slightly ajar. But it was shelter, and I wasn't in a position to be picky. I stepped onto the creaking porch and pushed the door open wider. The air inside was damp and stale, with a faint, musty odor that made me wrinkle my nose. The room was small, just one open space with a rusted wood stove in the corner and a rickety table that had collapsed under its own weight. Broken furniture was scattered around, and there were holes in the walls where the wood had rotted away. I didn't care. At least it was dry. I set my pack down and wrung out my jacket, shivering as the cold air hit my skin. My hands fumbled with the flashlight in my pocket, and when I turned it on, the beam flickered weakly before steadying. I scanned the room, taking in the details. There was a tangle of spider webs in one corner, and a pile of leaves had blown in through the broken window. A dark stain spread across the floor near the back wall, but I couldn't tell what it was in the dim light. I decided to focus on staying warm. There was a pile of old wood next to the stove, probably left behind by whoever used this place last. I wasn't sure if it would burn, but it was worth a shot. After some effort, I managed to get a small fire going. The heat was weak, but it was better than nothing. As I sat there warming my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the cabin. It wasn't just the way it looked. It was the atmosphere. The silence felt heavy, like the place was holding its breath. I told myself I was just spooking myself out. It was an old, abandoned building in the middle of the woods. Of course, it felt creepy. The rain kept pounding outside, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls. I tried to get comfortable, but every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. A creak, a faint shuffle, the sound of something brushing against the outside of the cabin. I kept telling myself it was the wind or an animal. Then I noticed something strange. There were marks on the floor near the stain, faint but visible in the firelight. At first, I thought they were scratches, but as I looked closer, I realized they were drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled across the floor. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to know what had made them. I tried to distract myself by rummaging through my pack for something to eat, but my appetite was gone. Every instinct was telling me to leave, but where would I go? The rain was still coming down in torrents, and I couldn't risk getting lost in the dark. Hours passed. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the temperature dropped even further. I wrapped myself in my damp sleeping bag, trying to stay warm. I told myself I'd leave as soon as the sun came up. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was pitch black. The fire had gone out completely, and the cabin was deathly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak. It wasn't the wind. It came from inside the cabin. My heart started pounding as I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam flickered to life, weak and sputtering, but it was enough to illuminate the room. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed the door. It was closed. I knew for a fact I hadn't shut it. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw the stain on the floor again. It looked darker now, almost fresh. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't know what I was going to do. Grab my pack, make a run for it, something. But before I could take a step, I heard another sound. It was coming from the far corner of the room, near the wood stove. A faint, wet squelch, like something being dragged across the floor. I swung the flashlight around, and the beam landed on the corner. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground, half hidden in the darkness. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. It was pale and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was obscured, but I could see the glint of its eyes reflecting the light. They were staring right at me. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was outside, stumbling through the rain and mud. My flashlight had died, and I was navigating by sheer panic, crashing through the underbrush as fast as my legs could carry me. I don't know how long I ran. When I finally stopped, I was soaked, shivering, and completely lost. The cabin was nowhere in sight. It took me hours to find my way back to the trail, and even longer to reach my car. By the time I did, the sun was rising, casting an eerie light over the forest. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that cabin. I think about the figure in the corner, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to stumble across its path. We decided to build a cabin in the fall of 2017. It was a random idea born from boredom during one of our weekend camping trips in the woods. My team and I, just four of us, thought it would be a great project. It wasn't for survival or anything. We just wanted a place where we could hang out, fish, hunt, and relax away from the noise of the city. We had the time, we had the tools, and we found a perfect spot deep in the woods of northern Montana. The location was ideal, or so we thought. It was far from any town, down an old logging road that barely looked like it had been used in years. Thick trees surrounded the area, but there was a small clearing near a creek where we planned to build. The sound of the running water added a peaceful vibe, and the clearing gave us enough space for the cabin without having to cut down too many trees. We were all in our late 20s, full of energy and a bit naive about what building a cabin would actually take. We spent weeks planning, sketching designs, and hauling materials to the site in our trucks. It was a lot of back and forth, but we were determined to get it done before the first snow. The first few days went smoothly. We cleared the brush, leveled the ground, and started framing the foundation. The weather was perfect, cool mornings and warm afternoons. But the deeper we got into the woods, the more I started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a subtle unease that crept in when I was alone. Maybe it was the quiet. Out here, there were no distant hums of cars or city life, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals. By the second week, we had the walls framed and the roof partially done. That's when things started to feel different. It wasn't just me anymore. The others noticed it too. The clearing didn't feel as welcoming as it had at first. The forest around us seemed darker, thicker, like it was closing in. We laughed it off at first, blaming it on exhaustion or maybe just our imaginations running wild. One afternoon, while we were working on the roof, we found footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't ours. They were barefoot, large, and the stride between them was longer than anything a person could make comfortably. At first, we thought it might be a bear, but the shape was wrong. Too human, too precise. We brushed it off, telling ourselves it was probably just a prank or maybe we'd misinterpreted what we saw. But that night, as we sat around the campfire, the forest felt alive. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, and every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made us glance over our shoulders. None of us said it out loud, but we were all on edge. A few days later, while hauling wood from a pile we'd left near the creek, we noticed some of the logs were missing. Not just a few, almost half the pile. The strange part was, there were no drag marks, no signs that the wood had been moved. It was just gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was faint at first, like a low whistle, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a bird or the wind. It sounded deliberate. It moved, circling the camp, and I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag, but eventually, the sound faded. The next morning, I told the others, but they just shrugged it off. Probably an animal, they said, but I could see in their eyes they didn't believe it either. We pressed on with the cabin, but things kept getting stranger. Tools would go missing only to show up in odd places. The half-built walls of the cabin were scratched, deep grooves running down the wood as if something or someone had clawed at them. Once, we found a dead deer near the clearing, its body torn open in a way that didn't look like the work of any predator we knew. By the third week, the unease had turned into dread. We started working in pairs, never letting anyone wander off alone. The forest seemed to watch us, the trees pressing in closer each day. We barely spoke, the silence between us heavy and tense. Then, one night, everything came to a head. We had just finished dinner and were sitting around the fire when we heard it. A deep, guttural growl from the woods, followed by the snap of branches. It was close, too close. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the trees, but the beams of light seemed to bounce off the darkness, revealing nothing. The growling came again, this time from the opposite direction, as if whatever it was had circled us. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it wasn't just one thing. It was more than one. We grabbed our knives, axes, anything we could use as a weapon, and huddled together, backs to the fire. The sounds grew louder, footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The forest fell silent, so quiet it was almost deafening. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, we decided to leave the camp and head for the trucks, which were parked about a mile down the logging road. We packed up what we could in a hurry and left the rest behind. As we made our way to the trucks, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every so often, we'd hear the sound of something moving in the trees, pacing us, but we never saw anything. When we finally reached the trucks, we threw our gear in the back and peeled out of there, not stopping until we were miles away. None of us spoke on the drive back, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging heavy in the air. We never went back to finish the cabin. A few weeks later, I tried looking up the area online, hoping to find some explanation for what we'd encountered. I didn't find much, just a few old stories about hikers going missing in the woods and local legends about strange creatures. But one detail stood out. A story about a group of loggers in the 1930s who abandoned a camp in the same area after reporting strange noises and seeing something they couldn't explain. To this day, I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just wildlife, maybe it was something else. All I know is that I still have nightmares about those nights in the forest. The cabin is probably still there, half-built, slowly being reclaimed by the woods. And whatever was out there that night, it's probably still watching. I visited my grandma's old farm cabin for the first time in over 10 years. It was tucked deep into the woods of Missouri, far from any town or neighbor, the kind of place where cell reception was non-existent, and the only sounds were those of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of old wood. I was 27 now, but I'd spent most of my childhood summers here, chasing fireflies and helping Grandma with chores around the farm. After she passed 5 years ago, the place had been sitting empty. My parents didn't want to sell it, and no one in the family had the time or interest to maintain it. Now, it had fallen to me to clean it up and prepare it for sale. I didn't want to, but I also didn't have a good excuse to get out of it. It was early spring when I arrived. The air was still crisp, and the trees were bare, their branches like skeletal hands reaching into the sky. The gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the cabin itself looked worse than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged in places, and the porch steps were warped and cracked. I parked my car and got out, grabbing my bag and the supplies I'd brought. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't just the sense of nostalgia or the weight of seeing a place that had once been so full of life now abandoned and decaying. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The inside of the cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. The kitchen still had Grandma's old cast iron pans hanging on the wall, and the cupboards were filled with jars of preserves that were probably decades past their expiration date. I spent the first few hours airing the place out and unpacking. I'd brought enough food and water for a few days, along with cleaning supplies, a sleeping bag, and a battery-powered lantern. There was no electricity or running water, but that didn't bother me. I'd grown up knowing how to make do without. As the sun began to set, I stepped outside to take in the view. The property stretched for acres, with fields that had long since been overtaken by weeds and a dense forest that bordered the back of the cabin. The horizon was painted in hues of orange and pink, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. That feeling didn't last long. I noticed something strange in the tree line at the edge of the property. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, but the longer I stared, the more certain I was that something was moving among the trees. It wasn't an animal. The movements were too deliberate, too human. I told myself it was probably just a hunter or a hiker passing through. This was rural Missouri, after all. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I locked the door and closed all the curtains, even though I felt a little silly doing it. It wasn't like I hadn't spent nights alone in this cabin before, but something about being here as an adult with no one else around for miles made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't as a kid. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept lightly, waking at every creak and groan of the old cabin. When morning came, I felt foolish for being so paranoid. I spent the day cleaning and organizing, sorting through Grandma's belongings and deciding what to keep and what to throw away. By the time the sun set again, I was exhausted. I made a quick dinner of canned soup and bread, then settled into my sleeping bag in the living room. I just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be a branch brushing against the window, but when I sat up and listened, I realized it was too rhythmic for that. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like someone was knocking on the side of the cabin. My heart started to race. I grabbed the lantern and shined it toward the windows, but the curtains blocked most of the light. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but deep down I didn't believe that. The tapping stopped, but I couldn't shake the unease it left behind. I stayed awake for hours, listening for any other sounds. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin to see if I could find any signs of what had caused the noise. I found nothing unusual at first. No tracks, no scratches, no signs of animals. But as I made my way to the back of the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt just outside the kitchen window, there were footprints. They were human, barefoot, and far too large to belong to a child. The prints led from the tree line to the cabin, then back again. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just some local kids messing around. But the fact that they'd been here during the night, so close to where I was sleeping, made me feel sick. That night, I barricaded the doors with furniture and kept the lantern on until its battery died. I didn't sleep at all. Every little sound set me on edge, and I kept imagining those footsteps creeping closer and closer. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things and loaded them into the car, planning to leave as soon as possible. But as I started the engine and put the car in reverse, I noticed something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a man. He was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair and clothes that hung off his frame like rags. He didn't move, didn't wave or call out. He just stood there, watching me. I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I called the police, but when they went to check the property, they found no sign of the man. The footprints were gone, too, erased by the rain that had started shortly after I left. I never went back to that cabin. My parents eventually sold it to a developer who tore it down to build a vacation home. Sometimes, I wonder if the new owners ever feel the same heaviness I did, if they ever notice the way the woods seem to hold their breath when the sun sets. But I try not to think about it too much. I tell myself it's over, that the man was just some drifter passing through. But deep down, I know I'll never really feel safe in the woods again. It was late October when my husband, his friend Mark, a cop from his department, and I decided to rent a cabin deep in the mountains of North Carolina. The idea had been tossed around for weeks, just a weekend getaway to disconnect from the chaos of the city. We were all in our mid-30s, and the appeal of escaping for a few days had sounded perfect. We chose a cabin about 30 miles outside of Asheville, surrounded by thick woods and isolated enough that we wouldn't hear a soul for miles. The cabin was small but charming, nestled on a hillside with a wraparound porch that overlooked a steep drop into the forest. The owner had described it as rustic, but it had all the basics: 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a wood-burning stove. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the 3 of us and the quiet of nature. The first day was uneventful. We arrived just before dusk, unpacked, and spent the evening drinking wine by the fireplace. Mark brought up some strange cases he'd worked on as a cop, stories that had us all a little spooked but mostly entertained. The mood was light, the air outside was crisp, and the faint sound of wind weaving through the trees was oddly calming. The next morning, my husband suggested we explore the woods behind the cabin. Mark, being an outdoor enthusiast, was eager to join. I hesitated at first. I wasn't much of a hiker, but eventually I gave in. We set off with backpacks, water bottles, and a small first aid kit, just in case. The forest was beautiful but dense. Towering pines blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the ground covered in a thick layer of needles and moss. As we ventured farther, the trail became harder to follow. It wasn't well marked, and we had to rely on the occasional ribbon tied to a tree to know we were still going the right way. After about an hour, we came across a clearing where the remnants of an old cabin stood. The structure was barely holding together. Its roof had caved in, and the wood was rotting. There were tools scattered around, rusted and ancient looking, and what appeared to be a fire pit filled with ash long gone cold. Something about the place made my stomach churn. Felt wrong, as though we were intruding on something we shouldn't have been. Mark, always curious, wandered closer to inspect the tools. My husband stayed back with me, sensing my unease. The wind seemed to pick up out of nowhere, and the trees around us began to sway, creaking like old floorboards. I told them I wanted to head back, and after some hesitation, they agreed. The walk back felt different. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By the time we reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The shadows had grown long, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. That night, as we sat around the fire, the unease I'd felt earlier hadn't gone away. The quiet of the woods, which had been so peaceful the night before, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. My husband tried to reassure me, but I could see he was on edge too. Mark, ever the skeptic, chalked it up to our imaginations running wild. Around midnight, we all went to bed. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, so my husband and I took one while Mark took the other. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds outside. At first, it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. I nudged my husband awake, but by the time he listened, the sound had stopped. He told me it was probably an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were boots. I showed them to my husband and Mark, and both of them grew serious. Mark, being a cop, inspected them closely and determined they were fresh, likely made sometime during the night. We spent the day trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Mark suggested we stick close to the cabin and keep the doors locked, just in case. I wanted to leave, but my husband convinced me we were overreacting. He didn't want to cut the trip short over what he called a random hiker passing by. That evening, we decided to build a fire outside in the fire pit. It was an attempt to lighten the mood, but it didn't work. The woods felt like they were closing in on us. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Mark kept his gun holstered on his hip, something he didn't usually do unless he felt there was a reason. As the fire burned low, we all decided to head inside. Just as I was about to step onto the porch, I heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from the trees. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human, but wrong, like someone trying to mimic an animal call and failing. We froze, staring into the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. Mark drew his gun and told us to get inside. My husband grabbed my arm and pulled me through the door. We locked it and turned off all the lights, sitting in the dark with only the embers from the fire outside glowing faintly through the window. For hours, we sat in silence, listening. The sound didn't come again, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. Around 3 a.m., just as we were starting to relax, there was a loud bang on the side of the cabin. It was followed by another, then another, as though someone was slamming their fists against the walls. Mark shouted for whoever it was to leave, his voice firm but betraying a hint of fear. The banging stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the back of the cabin, we heard the unmistakable sound of a window shattering. Mark motioned for us to stay put while he went to investigate. My husband grabbed a kitchen knife and stood by the door, his face pale. I sat frozen, clutching a flashlight, barely able to breathe. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for Mark to return. When he finally did, his face was grim. He told us the back window had been broken, but whoever or whatever had done it was gone. There were no tracks, no sign of anyone, just the shattered glass and the cold wind blowing in. None of us slept that night. The first light, we packed up and left. The drive back to the city was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we got home that Mark mentioned something he hadn't told us before. As he'd inspected the broken window, he'd found something wedged into the frame. A small, folded piece of paper. On it, in smeared handwriting, were 3 words, "You're not alone. I haven't been back to the mountains since." It was the winter of 2019, and I was 28 at the time. I needed a break. Living in Chicago, the noise, the people, the constant movement, it was starting to get to me. I had just gone through a rough breakup, work was piling on the stress, and I felt like I was constantly on edge. I decided to book a remote cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a good 6-hour drive away. Somewhere quiet, surrounded by snow-covered forests and no people. A week to clear my head. The cabin was off a private road, surrounded by thick pine trees. When I pulled up in my old Subaru, the place looked like something out of a postcard, small, wooden, with smoke already curling out of the chimney. I had rented it from a guy named Tom, who had texted me the lockbox code and said he wouldn't be around, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me and the woods for a while. I had packed plenty of food, warm clothes, books, and even some firewood. The cabin was cozy, with a single bedroom, a wood-burning stove, and big windows overlooking the trees. It felt safe, isolated in the best way. There was no cell service, but I didn't mind. I wanted to disconnect anyway. The first 2 days were perfect. I slept in, read by the fire, took short hikes around the property, and just let myself breathe. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. But on the 3rd day, something felt off. It started when I went for a morning hike. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was a pale gray. I followed a trail that led deeper into the woods, crunching through the snow. After about half an hour, I noticed faint tracks, boot prints. They were old, maybe a few days, and heading in the same direction as me. I thought it was strange, considering how remote the area was, but figured someone else must have been out here recently. I kept walking, but the tracks didn't sit right with me. They didn't seem to go anywhere. After another 15 minutes, they just stopped, right in the middle of the trail. No sign of where the person had gone, no side trails, no evidence they had turned back. Just gone. It gave me a weird feeling, but I shook it off. Maybe the snow had covered the rest of the tracks, or maybe they had cut through the woods. Still, I decided to head back to the cabin, the eerie silence of the forest weighing on me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd watched too many true crime documentaries, and the isolation was getting to me. I built up the fire, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and tried to relax. But around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, then stopped. I got up and looked out the window, but it was pitch black outside. The porch light didn't reach far, and all I could see was snow and shadows. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about it felt deliberate, like someone was pacing just out of sight. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went outside to check for tracks, but the snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of anything near the cabin. I felt a little silly, like I'd scared myself for no reason, but the unease lingered. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I read, chopped some wood, and tried to keep my mind occupied. As the sun set, I locked all the doors and windows and made sure the curtains were drawn. I felt better once the fire was going, the warm light filling the small space. But as the night went on, the feeling of being watched came back. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Then I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. This time they were closer. I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the fire, and moved to the window. My heart was pounding as I peeked through the curtains, scanning the dark forest. For a moment I saw nothing. Then movement, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out much, just a tall shape, barely visible in the faint moonlight. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere? And why were they watching me? I didn't want to panic, but every instinct was screaming at me to do something. I grabbed the hatchet I'd been using to chop wood and sat by the fire, listening. The footsteps started again, circling the cabin. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately. They knew I was inside. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, every creak of the cabin making me jump. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow. They led around the cabin, stopping at each window. I felt sick. Whoever it was had been looking in, watching me. I packed my things as fast as I could, shoving everything into my bags. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I just wanted to get out of there. But when I opened the door, I froze. On the porch, there was a small pile of sticks, arranged in the shape of a person. I stared at it, my blood running cold. This wasn't random. Someone had left it there, a message or a warning. I got in my car and drove, not stopping until I was hours away. Even now, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. I've always been fascinated by Australia. Growing up in the UK, I'd spent countless hours watching documentaries about its wild, untamed nature and reading stories about the early settlers. So, when I finally saved up enough to take a long vacation, I decided I'd explore as much of the Australian outback as possible. It wasn't just about the big tourist spots. I wanted the real, rugged experience, far from cities and crowds. It was 2019, and I was 32, eager to challenge myself and take the kind of trip that sticks with you for life. After spending a couple of weeks in Sydney and Melbourne, I rented a camper van and headed north toward Queensland, where I planned to spend some time hiking and camping near the coast. Along the way, I stopped at small towns, stocked up on supplies, and got tips from locals about places I shouldn't miss. One afternoon, I found myself in a small town called Ravenswood. It was a sleepy, almost forgotten place, the kind you'd drive through without a second glance. But as I grabbed a coffee at the only cafe in town, I overheard a group of older men talking about a cabin deep in the bushland that had been abandoned for decades. They mentioned it almost casually, like a local legend, and I couldn't help but listen in. From what I gathered, it had been built in the early 1900s by a settler family but was left to rot after some kind of tragedy. They didn't go into much detail, but the way they spoke about it gave me the impression that people didn't go there often, if ever. That's what intrigued me. I wasn't looking for ghost stories or anything supernatural. I just wanted to see a piece of history, something untouched by time. So I asked the barista about it. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, "It's just an old ruin, nothing worth seeing." I shrugged it off, but the idea stuck with me. The next day, I found myself poring over a map at the town's small visitor center, trying to figure out how to get there. It wasn't marked, of course, but with the vague directions I'd overheard and a bit of guesswork, I thought I could manage. I set out early, leaving my camper van parked at a rest area and heading into the bush with a day pack. The trail wasn't official, just a faint path through the dense eucalyptus trees, but it was easy enough to follow at first. The sun was high, and the air was hot and dry, but I'd prepared for that. Plenty of water, a hat, and sunscreen. After about an hour of walking, the path became harder to see. The trees closed in around me, and the ground was uneven, covered in loose rocks and dry leaves. It felt like I was walking into a different world, far removed from the bustling cities I'd left behind. I saw kangaroos in the distance, heard the calls of birds I couldn't identify, and occasionally stopped to take in the view. By mid-afternoon, I started to doubt myself. I hadn't seen any sign of the cabin, and the further I went, the more it felt like I was completely alone. The idea of turning back crossed my mind, but something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit I'd wasted a day chasing a rumor. Finally, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I saw it. The cabin was tucked into a clearing, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and tall grass. It wasn't much to look at, just a small wooden structure with a rusted tin roof and a sagging porch. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I approached cautiously, not out of fear but curiosity. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was weathered and gray, and the ground around it was littered with debris, broken tools, scraps of metal, and what looked like the remains of an old fence. Stepping onto the porch, I felt the boards creak under my weight. I pushed the door open and peered inside. The air was stale and smelled faintly of rot. The interior was sparse. Just a single room with a crumbling fireplace, a broken table, and a couple of chairs that looked like they'd collapse if you tried to sit on them. What struck me most was the silence. Outside, I'd heard the sounds of the bush, birds, insects, the occasional rustle of leaves. But inside the cabin, it was like the world had gone completely still. I spent some time exploring, taking photos and trying to imagine what life must have been like for the people who'd lived here. There were a few personal items left behind: a rusted kettle, a chipped plate, and a wooden box filled with tools. On one wall, someone had scratched a series of lines, maybe to mark the passage of time. As the light began to fade, I realized I needed to head back. I didn't want to be stuck out here after dark, especially since I wasn't entirely sure I could find my way back to the trail. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. About 20 meters from the cabin, There was a small clearing with a pile of stones arranged in a neat rectangle. Took me a moment to realize it was a grave. There was no headstone, just a wooden cross stuck into the ground, its paint long since worn away. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the cabin didn't seem so quaint or charming. It felt oppressive, like the air around it was heavier than it should be. I didn't linger. I started back toward the trail, moving as quickly as I could without losing my footing. But the further I went, the more disoriented I became. The path I'd followed so easily earlier now seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't recognize. By the time the sun set, I was completely lost. The darkness came quickly, and with it, the realization that I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My flashlight barely cut through the blackness, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of my boots on the ground, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of some animal I couldn't identify. I kept moving, hoping I'd stumble onto something familiar, but the harder I tried, the more hopeless it felt. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate steps that stopped whenever I stopped. I turned around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there. The fear crept up on me gradually, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Eventually, I came across a dry creek bed and decided to follow it, reasoning that it might lead me back to civilization. I don't know how long I walked, hours maybe, but it felt like an eternity. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was enough to give me hope. I stumbled toward it, my legs aching and my throat dry, until I reached a small campsite. There was no one there, just an abandoned tent and a smoldering fire. It was eerie, but at that moment I didn't care. I collapsed next to the fire, grateful for the warmth and light. As I sat there, trying to collect myself, I noticed something odd. The tent flap was open, and inside, there was a backpack with a map sticking out of the top. Curious, I pulled it out and unfolded it. It wasn't just any map. It was a detailed layout of the area, complete with marked trails and landmarks. And there, in the bottom corner, was the cabin I'd visited. Next to it, someone had written a single word: "Don't." I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I used the map to find my way back to the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. I don't know who left that map or why they abandoned their camp, but one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to that cabin. Some places are better left alone.